All right, so my name is Reverend Keiryu Liên Shutt. I'm ordained in the Suzuki Roshi lineage by Blanche. She was my teacher as a layperson, priest, and Dharma transmitted. So, as many of you said, this is a really distressing time worldwide, first by COVID, and then the repercussions of COVID, such as economic situation for many of us. And then now, of course, this very not new and just much more obvious and upfront racism, not only in the US, we're seeing it with George Floyd and the way, and I think it's not unrelated that a white woman in Central Park, faked her distress because she understood the power structure of racism. And, because we've seen many Black lives, men and women, and perhaps other non-binary that we don't know. In fact, it's true. I shouldn't even say perhaps. Yes, there's been a lot of distress. And of course, and I'm gonna say a few things which might be distressing because I know we all have seen the video, so I'm doing it with intention. Of course, it was really difficult to watch the video, right? 8.46, right? 8 minutes, 46 seconds of someone basically being killed, murdered, and telling us, describing his, can you imagine? I will say I consider us sitting still for that long, and even thinking, as meditator, our breath is so important that to imagine not having breath for that long. My adoptive father died of emphysema, and so I watched him struggle with breath for the last months of his life, and it's really distressing to watch, and I know that it's really distressing for the person. And then to hear, of course, his describing his death, his calling for his mother. I mean, that just hits. And I will say that I also was incredibly distressed by seeing the way that Officer Chauvin, not just the knee on the neck, but just his facial expression. That's what I also was really blown away by. Just a really disregard. Like he's like bored or like, and again, that's again taking on this attitude. And then as a Asian American and political, I will say it was like, there's that cop standing there that's Asian, and he looked like he could have been Vietnamese, which I am. So I was, and it turns out he's Hmong. And so there was lots of layers of distress watching that. And of course, again, with the pandemic, it's not separate. I feel like actually that our practice is the practice of distress. Really, we take the posture. Well, I will say, let me just back up for a minute and say that as I went to sit down today with you all, I'm really aware that, in Zen we say the posture itself is Buddha. The posture itself is Buddha, not like Buddha, not like could be Buddha. In taking this posture of awakening, we are Buddha. And so, of course, for most of us, and it seemed like, at least in this group that I can see, we're sitting down. So in the seated posture or in the meditative posture, it could be lying. Most of us in this kind of meditation are either sitting down or lying down. And of course, the Buddha could say could stand and walk also. And so in the seated posture, and especially in Zen, we're really into sitting still. And in that stillness, it's really useful because then you can really watch the subtlety. Right? You can really observe what is going on. And it does begin right here in this body, this heart, and this mind as it is right now. And so what is the posture of awakening? And it is one of openness. You know, in Zen, the first foundation of mindfulness is awareness of the body and the body. And while there are 5 of them, most of the tradition, we start with posture in Zen, and then a lot of other Buddhist tradition, there's also the emphasis on breath. And so when we, give Zazen instruction, this is the posture where we lift our chest and settle it. It's one of opening of the chest. So there's an openness and a settledness in this seat. And mostly our practice is to be a witness. That's where we start. We're a witness. We sit still to witness what is happening. And that is, you could say, a version of the instruction in response to what we're supposed to do with the first noble truth, right? That in life there is suffering, there's dukkha, right? Usually translated as suffering. I myself like dis-ease because it feels very body, discontent, dissatisfaction. And I would say in these days, it's also distress. So our practice is to bear witness to being with our disease. It's not turning away from it. It's like however much and it was true, Dep and I kept trying to turn away in some way, or you go like this when you watch such a video, because it's hard. And and yet we have to be a witness. We have to acknowledge. And I would take the first instruction, classically it's called to investigate. So I would say to witness, and I would actually would also to say to acknowledge fully, right? What is the distress that is happening right now? That earlier in the week, now that police officers are kneeling with the protesters, right? On a national morning news, American National Morning News channel, they were interviewing the police chief in New York who was kneeling, right? And then afterwards, they were saying, interviewing him and saying, do you think there is, the charge, or the people are saying that there's racism in the New York police force? And would you say that that's true? And he's like, oh, no. Right? There's no racism. There are people who are racist. And on one level, I can hear that distinction, right? That he's trying to say not the whole thing, except we have to, at this point, it cannot be an individual. Just as our witnessing cannot just be an internal witness, we need to go witness the suffering of the world. And so the interviewer said at the end, back in the studio, that, if you don't have, it's hard to watch that while there's sympathy, there isn't the ability to acknowledge that there's racism, there's a systemic racism. Because if you don't start from the same place, how do we even dialogue or have any sense of resolution if we don't all admit to the problem? Doesn't mean that we don't have different nuances or have different perspective on it. And we have to have some basis that this is so. Right? And we as queer people or allies will also understand that, right? If people are just like, oh, you can love whoever you want, but then don't admit to that there's oppression of queer folks, then there's no way to fix it in a bigger sense, not just an individual sense. And so the posture that we take is also one of receiving, right? It's open to receiving information, and especially information that is difficult, that is distressful, that is not satisfaction, that is discontent, that is painful. And of course, we're doing that with ourselves. And of course, like I could talk about, you know, the obvious one is we witness our own body distress, right? You know, early on in the whole shelter in place, you know, I know many teachers have talked about sheltering places like being in a sesshin, because you're just with yourself, right? And this body, this heart, and this mind, and in a way you're secluded. And so it is watching all that dis-ease and how do we manage that. I know that a joke someone sent me early on was, you know, like when the whole 6 feet distancing, now it just seems like normal thing, but when that whole thing started coming out and, you know, and someone's like, oh, you know, I need to stay 6 feet away from my refrigerator, right? That's the distancing I need to be practicing, right? And so that shows how we deal. Like, yeah, many of us can relate to that. When we're distressful, we go to eat, or just go to distract ourselves, right? And so we watch our own, and that kind of practice in sesshin or on the cushion, we can see it as relating to ourselves, to our emotions for the most part, and also our thoughts and our beliefs. And I think that's the other thing, is that, you know, I apologize, I don't remember his name, and I meant to look it up, I forgot. Another interview was, there's a museum now, and if someone remembers, and I can't remember where it is either, but I think somewhere in the south of, as a memorial to all the lynching in the United States. And they literally, what they wanted to do is they had these poles that represent bodies. And the director of that museum, and again, I apologize, I don't remember his name, an African-American gentleman. And he said that, you know, while in essence, the slavery in the sense of individuals, right, not of being owned and of being oppressed in that way is done, the greater injustice that hasn't changed is the construction of how Black people are not people, right? And that's the part that we have to dismantle at this point, is our beliefs that we've been taught, right? And we know that as practitioner, that the biggest illusion, right, is how we think, what are our beliefs, and then from those beliefs we act on them, and it determines our behavior. And we're taught who and what is of value, whose life is of more value than other. And then also in our watching of distress, to me, so much of what I've witnessed as my distress is when I feel inconvenienced. And so how is it that we now can see that the greater suffering and distress we need to witness is not just about our comfort, right? So this is why also our practice is to be with difficulties and see the kind of difficulty for what it is. Is it just inconvenient that, you know, I know by this, I don't mean it as people are complaining, and I've heard a lot from people about how protesters are outside their window and there's helicopters, and equating it to war zone. And I'm really sorry to say, it is not a war zone. Having lived through one, is not a war zone. It is distressful for sure, And yet, because of American conditioning, the United States conditioning, we equate this little bit of distress, right? In terms of noise, in terms of body senses, as something larger. And most of there are wars actually happening now in the world. And so we want to also be informed, right? Appropriately informed, and appropriately negotiate our distress in relation to what's going on. Because my distress, right, as a Asian American, and of course we all know that during the pandemic, this whole Chinese virus thing there's been a lot of racism towards people of Asian descent also. And yet, in comparison to Black lives, right, not that one is more than the other. And right now, the distress is very much about actual lives, right? So we're here to be receptive to information that's difficult, that's distressful, and that we don't understand. So we need to practice listening. I will say, and I'm getting closer and closer to enacting this, I will say that after the elections of Donald Trump, right, one thing I realized is that it really seemed that one group of people, and this is, you know, not just my thought, of white men, working class white men, do not feel heard and seen. And this is one group that really voted for Trump. And as an Asian American, where invisibility is so much part of the racism towards us, I said, oh, I can relate to that. And so I thought, oh, I should go out and do deep listening, right? And just really, and while I can relate to that, I really don't understand how that feels for them and is for. And so I would go out and do deep listening. And then I couldn't do it because I was like, I don't know if I can sit still and receive that kind of information. And yet now witnessing, right, how there's another story about a Black woman who was talking to police, you know, in the whole riot gear, except his visor was up. And I apologize, I don't remember the city. And she was expressing how distressful things were. And this is the intention of the news story, right? And then at the end, they hugged the police officer and her. And then they interviewed her, and she said, it was a transformative moment because I could look into his eyes and I can see, right? And he heard me, and that was a transformative moment. And so how is it that we can just use this still position that we've learned from practice to be able to receive information we don't understand? Probably in the next week, maybe even this coming week, I'm going to do an online version where I'm going to invite people to just come, and we will all just be a witness. You know, maybe in the chat, people will sign in and say, I would like to speak. Of course, I'm trying to figure out some container so that it's not just, you know, inappropriate Zoom bombing kind of thing, right? So if that happens, maybe I can send it to Cato and he can send it out. And I'm, you know, trying to figure out how we can do it in safety in person. So the other thing then, so deep listening, which is so much, as Thich Nhat Hanh would say, that's a huge part of skillful, wise speech. Right speech is listening. It's not just how we speak, but it's the receiving of the information, the holding of people's truth, especially truth we don't understand. And then, of course, part of that is we've had a whole kind of practice with not knowing. Right? This is our beginner's mind, is the mind that doesn't know, that is willing to be informed, or as, of course, Dogen says, right? To go forth and experience a myriad things is delusion, but the myriad things come forth and experience themselves is awakening, which means that we're practicing to let phenomena internally and externally inform us, not to go and interpret, and decide what needs to happen and how they should do it. Of course, we can decide what we want to do, and also for ourselves, just pausing to let our emotions inform us, take their course, and from there decide, balancing that with wisdom and experience, and also not just an individual experience and wisdom, but collective. And then, of course, we're also sitting with intentionality. Because when we go to sit down, we're making a vow. Right? And in fact, perhaps it's because obviously I'm a priest and I've obviously done several public vowing. By the way, a vowing is public. And it's public not just because it's saying, witness me making these vows. It's public, you do know it's public because you're asking everyone present to support you to live your vows. And that your vow is with everyone. And so our vow is to be with distress. Our vow is to actually take those other positions, right? Standing, I heard a story about a white aunt of a friend who has a black niece, and she's older and she's really afraid of this whole COVID thing. But she went to a protest, stood at the edge so that she could be a witness, right, in response to George Floyd, and then for her black niece. It should be for herself also, I would say. And I would say it was probably for herself. Maybe she couldn't acknowledge that. So standing as witness, standing as engagement, and of course all the walking that's been done in these protests, these marches. So these are meditative positions also. Lying down, there's been protests where people lie down for the 8 minutes and 46 seconds in the same position. And I would say perhaps we could add kneeling would be another meditative posture that perhaps the Buddha, if he was around now, might say is also a meditative posture. Can kneeling also be our posture, our vowing posture as witness and as engaging, not just witnessing, but really engaging our intentionality, our aspiration, our willingness to be receptive, open, to be with conditions, to be with people, especially those we are taught as other. Also, I'm really grateful, right, that we could come from a tradition in which the posture, right, that we are Buddha, means that we begin, right, we rest, and our practice, in my opinion, our practice is mostly to give us confidence, right, that we are Buddha, right? Because our tradition, and then to have more and more faith that what is taught in the tradition, that we are Buddha, right? You don't have to become Buddha. We are Buddha. And so practice helps us to remember, to come back, right, to the knowledge that we are whole, perfect, and complete. Of course, we can be more skillful. In essence, though, it is I would say a belief, but it needs to be a belief that's enacted. That's also the greatness of Zen, right? The greatness of Zen is it has to be an interaction. The Bodhisattva vow is with others, right? I'm not here to find ease. reduce my stress, or find contentment and satisfaction for myself. I'm doing it with others. This is our vow. This is the Mahayana's vow. And so how do we also, once we become more and more confident in our Buddha-ness, so we also go and dismantle all the ways in which the Buddha-ness of all phenomena, especially of all beings, is also not made available to them, to others, to all of us. So that's what we're dismantling, the lack of access to be able to know your wholeness, your completeness, because from wholeness and completeness, and then that wholeness and completeness is interconnected, then how can we harm another? How can we look bored? How could we even put our knee on someone else's neck? That's the thing. Because if this is my sibling, if George Floyd pain is my pain, if his life is my life, then I will not be able to do such an act. This is, and yet we have to practice that, and we have to keep dismantling all the ways in which some part of us, want to identify with that versus that. I didn't want to identify with that Asian American cop, right? And yet I have to. I have to know closer and closer to how I might be in the same position and do the same thing, because in knowing that, then I have awareness in acknowledging my hate, greed, and delusion. Then I can be more careful and intentional about how I don't enact that. So, we are privileged to have this practice and to be able to practice this practice the way we do. We're all in shelter, for one thing. And so from this place of privilege, which many of you have said, you acknowledge and have gratitude that we can do this. From this place, can we carry our posture of awakening as we sit, stand, walk, lie down, and I would propose to you, kneel when appropriate. With the world, with the distress of the world. Thank you very much. I would be really honored to take any comments, requests, and I take challenges. Kato.
I just have a statement that it's something that's been not only bothering me during this, these situations, but also just even before. And I just wanted to say it and get what you think about it. I'm so exhausted in this country of money being more important than anything else. I mean, I keep thinking to myself, why are the police forces not inundated and flooded with mental health professionals who do fit for work checks? Why is there not better oversight? Why do we hire murdering thugs? Why are there not classes when you work in a certain community to help deprogram the connection of skin color and criminal? And I come back to because it costs money. Why don't people who are sick and old die rather than being treated because of money? Why we have a president who said, I'm not going to shut down the country again in the future because it's hurt our economy. So it's better if people die than if we have our economy go through a downturn. And I don't know, I get so frustrated about it. I realize that money is power in this country and they're equal, or they you know, money means power. But I don't know. Have you thought about that, or what do you think about that? Or, you know, from a Buddhist perspective, you know, how does this work with our relationship with this freaking money that is more important than anything else?
Uh-huh. Thank you. Question. I would say that those who practice with me will know that I don't like why. And the reason for that is I know that when I go why, I have a sense of I already know what the answer is for me, and also it's very, to me, you know, I'm just putting out, you asked what my response is. So I find how much more useful as a practice. How is it that we have a president that would say these things? How is it? Which on a certain level doesn't mean we don't come to the same answer, mind you, but and in how it's much more open, and I'm investigating. I'm seeing how, and if I go to ask other how, then I get more information. And then how is it then that this can be different? It opens me up much more. I know when I'm why, I'm an aversive type, if you don't know me. So my why is usually a pushing away. Why is he like that? Why are they like that? Whereas how, then I'm activating my curiosity. How is this possible? Just like my sense of my aspiration of the deep listening practice that I was talking about is then I will know, like basically the deep listening is how do you come to what you believe? Tell me, inform me, right? And then hopefully how can we find commonality, and then how can we change this? And I think having ways of being, because capitalism doesn't, on one level, yes, of course, money is power. And obviously we're in a capitalist system in the United States. And it isn't the only way to be a nation, you know? So how can we change that capitalism doesn't have to be? Like we got really close, you know, I mean, technically we have, you know, healthcare for all, kind of, you know, and it's just started to crumble. But that was one way of how we could have a different way to provide, as opposed to, of course, you know, it's a multi-layer thing. So it's just an example of how, if we try to find different ways. Does that answer your question? Or
I think no, I think that's great. I think I agree with you. I think my questioning of why was a pushing away, and I think you're right. I think how is listening and thinking about how to improve it.
Okay. Don't forget our other big thing is we think we're, you know, isolated. So don't forget, ask with others. This is a time in which we have to rely on our communities and the connections we've made to inform us. By that also doesn't mean that we shouldn't have some skillful wisdom, right? I've heard so many, I myself have had some experience, but I know that many Black people, you know, I've heard from people they haven't heard from years about what certain people should do. So yeah, as someone, at least one of you said earlier, informing yourself is also useful. How comes with different. Yes, Richard?
Oh, thank you. Listening closely to the words said today, I get the impression that one of the things I am learning through what's happening and that I see happening in the media is that ordinary Americans such as myself are getting a clearer picture of what the word domination means. We are understanding physically what Black people have felt for centuries in America, that they were dominated. And when we see physical force used against citizens in our streets, we understand what physical domination is in a way that we haven't had to previously. I can see that now in the media. In my life, I have never felt physically and threatened by police officers, but now I understand why Black people do feel physically threatened by police officers. And I begin to fear for not just Black people now, but for all people, because we have a president who is speaking about physically dominating our population. That's all I have to say.
Richard, since you have been coming to Hartford for a while, and I know you've been to a few of my talks, and we've talked in the tea, can I interact with you a little bit on this? Would you be open to a little exchange?
Oh, yes, of course.
So, thank you. And it is empathy in the sense of how it could happen to me, which is, a layer of empathy is useful. This is why getting to know people that are not around us, or that we've been told are, will hurt us, or will don't look like us, or whatever other is, right, is useful, because then you can say, oh, right, when I have a friend or a sibling or someone who, a sangha mate, a kalyana mitra, that I can see the effect of harm that I am not experiencing due to my privilege, then it makes me relate. And certainly when it feels like it might come to myself in proximity, it helps us to connect. And our practice is also, because I will say that I had a little ouch in your beginning, which is that us normal people. And I really want to really ask you to be aware of that deep listening. I often say that Zazen is deep listening, right? Because we're just sitting there by ourselves, and come on, mostly we hear all our internal dialogue. And our practice is, to let part of the practice intention of letting thoughts just come and go is not to get caught in the content, without a doubt. And when you don't get caught in the content, then you start to see the patterns of them, one, and then also another layer of practice is to see how we believe in them. What is our belief in them? And is it true now? Does it fit this situation now? So we start to be really noticing how it is and where it is that we frame our experience. That is, one, we acknowledge that this is my point of view. And so it's not that we negate that. What we do, though, is we say, oh, that's my point of view. And if I was and actually not if you're a bodhisattva. There's no if I'm in relation to other people. When I'm in relation to other people, then how would the impact of the way I frame experience, what is the impact on them? And I'm sure my tenderness is also my location in the matrix of oppression, is that a flavor of Asian American racism is that we're not part of the United States. We're not American enough. We're the perpetual foreigner. And perhaps as queers, we also, as oppressed people, we have to also be careful. When part of listening is listening to how we've internalized. So I wonder if the norm was that homophobic internalization. right? Because what is normal? There is no, normal is only in relation to, it's only oppressors who tell you what normal is when you're out of sync with what they think normal is, right? So, yeah. How's that landing, Richard?
I would say I'd have to agree with you. One of the reasons I moved to San Francisco 30 years ago was that I felt I could be exactly who I wanted to be in public and in the workplace. And I didn't quite get that feeling in my hometown of Boston. And I have, so here in this city, I have felt liberated. This is more or less the Republic of San Francisco. It has its own spirit. And I always felt that spirit when I came to this city, and I wanted to be here immediately, so I moved here. Now I see that spirit of just being able to be who you are, being endangered on a national scale, because ordinary people are showing up in the streets and demonstrating that spirit, and they're being threatened, sometimes beaten, gassed, and so on, right before our eyes. And now we understand, I think, what the threat is now in our body politic. And it means much more now to become actively engaged. Politics is about becoming actively engaged in the body politic. And it's not just a matter of staying home. And when I see people coming out into the streets and actively engaging and seeing their courage, it does motivate me to do the same now. And that's what I feel. Ordinary people have to come out and become actively engaged in order to let the people in power know that they can't get away with dominating people. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to invite, if your tendency, and by tendency, I don't actually mean just your personal, because we are systemically conditioned. If your tendency, habitual tendency, I like to say that that's kind of karma, is to move forward, then I invite you to step back. And if your habitual tendency, which is supported, colluded, reinforced by systems, is to, and I even see there's my ability privilege coming through, and I would take back the word step, so is generally to move forward, then I will invite you to move back. And if your habitual tendency is to move back, I want to invite you to move forward and share yourself. Christina, are you still on?
I am.
Christina.
I'm still on.
Okay. Do you want to share anything, perchance?
In general, on how I'm feeling.
Yeah, in response to the talk. Christina's a student.
I think I have tried to be extra conscientious of, I've opened my space even more to my friends who are Black, for them to be able to call me or video chat with me. And also I reach out to them a lot more. because a lot of what's coming up for them is having white friends who are saying, I'm exhausted, this is exhausted, seeing all of that. And to a Black person, hearing a white person say, I'm exhausted is very painful. And so I try to open my space not to just my Black friends, but to kind of carry the weight of that space to my white friends, to not reach out to the Black friends of ours to express their exhaustion, because I feel, as a person of color who's not Black, I feel responsible to help carry the weight. So it's not put on Black friends and family, because there's enough weight that they're carrying. So I think that's important to note. I think it's important to ask the hows and to your Black friends and Black community on how they are feeling. And if they're expressing something that may come off to you or you might interpret as aggressive, understand that it's not you, that they need to feel a safe space to express. And sometimes I do think it's just nice to even call your Black friends and family and offer to just sit with them like we are. Because a lot of times the silence in that way, giving the space, feels really good to them, to just have a moment of quiet. Because right now everybody hopefully is fighting the fight.
Great. Christina, since you're a student, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Tell me how you're doing this for yourself. Can you come on by chance, picture-wise?
Yeah, it goes in and out, so sometimes it freezes you and then it just gets weird. So
how is what you're doing for yourself?
For myself, because yes, it is very important to take care of yourself in order to hold the space for others.
Speak in the eye, Christina, remember?
I
You.
Oh, I am trying to come back into practice. I haven't been practicing. I can tell when my container is broken and I need to reset, and that's where I'm at. So like this morning I did the SF Zen Center Zazen instruction again because I feel that distant from my practice. So I just wanted to review and then trying to come back into A to Z and trying to not make excuses for not sitting when I wake up. That's what I'm doing right now.
Yeah, I think we have to remember that how do we make our sense of self not a problem? Right? So the only way, a way I would say to work with this is to remember, and I think it's also a way that doesn't burn us out, is to remember that any action you take, what is it that's for yourself? What is it that's for yourself? Right? Because racism, let's talk about racism, affects us all. All the isms affect us all. Because we're affected by the world. Our location changes. And so the appropriateness of how much space we take up. I would say that I need to expand on this, but Indra's net, I don't know the Indra's net. Indra's net is a sense that there's a net that connects us all, and each of us are like a jewel at a connection point, and we all reflect each other. And that's a really useful analogy, image to hold. And I will say that I would like to emphasize the net, right? And so depending on conditions, sometimes my jewel is getting a lot more resources. There's a lot more easy access of energy to my jewel. And it can stress the net itself. So our practice is not to care for the jewels, because there is inequality if we're, so given the conditions of the world, the jewels are all different, fed different ways, and some stress the net a lot. And so how is it that we keep the pathways open so that there's enough resources, enough nourishment to all the jewels? And if how can I move the resources? Maybe this is one answer you, Cato. How do I help move the resources through to support, to take the stress off of one part of the net? Or because of the lack of support, a jewel does not have air. Let's just make it really direct, and can't breathe. How do I get oxygen over there? How do I get oxygen over there? Especially if I happen to have extra oxygen, given my location and the way that resources are flowing in this condition. All right, well, I'm up at 11. I think this is a good time. And all right, thank you very much. I so appreciate being able to be with you. I will say that when I sat down and could see you all, I'm so grateful for this sangha and this sanctuary, because the connections we do have as queers, as oppressed people in that way, or allies of it, supports me, I know, to go out and engage with the world and witness and engage and be with and try to alleviate the suffering, and at some point to end the distress of the world. Thank you very much.